Good evening, everyone. I'm so very happy to see you all here tonight at this benefit for the Helping Hands of Round Pond and our restoration of the Round Pond Meeting House. My name is Nancy Evans, and I am the president of the Helping Hands of Round Pond. We have two speakers tonight, Keith Mestrich and Heather Cox Richardson, and I want to say a few words about them before they come on stage. Keith is a resident of Bristol and lives down in New Harbor. He is a very active person in the area. Many of you may know him. He is active in the town politics in Bristol. He's on the board of many organizations, the Central Lincoln County Y, the Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens. He's on the board for the Old Bristol Historical Society and for the Francis Perkins Center. We are so very, very lucky to have his leadership with us in this peninsula. He's just a really wonderful person, and he's going to be really an amazing person to have a conversation with Heather Cox Richardson. Keith comes to this area with over 30 years of executive leadership. He has been the president and the CEO of Amalgamated Bank. He is right now one of the founding members of an organization called Per Capita that is establishing platforms for low-income people to firm up their finances. And he has many years of experience in the American labor movement. So he is going to be a really wonderful conversation partner for Heather Cox Richardson. So Heather, I know all of us love Heather Cox Richardson, and we read her, and yes, Heather is an author, a scholar, an historian. Academically, Heather has come by where she is really honestly. She went to Harvard, and she was both at Harvard as an undergraduate and as a graduate student. I grew up with Heather, and when Heather told me when we were in college that she was going to be studying the Washburns are a Republican family, 19th century Maine. I had no idea, like, why are you studying this? I couldn't quite grapple with that concept in my 20-year-old mind. But it actually opened up many doors for Heather, and it has allowed her to become who she is, both as a person who studies history, who studies politics, who studies Maine and the goodness of the people of Maine. She got her PhD from Harvard. She started out her career in a pretty conventional academic fashion. She wrote scholarly books, published them with scholarly presses, and she also, along the way, became interested in public history. And it is this that is really fascinating, because she has turned her expertise and her love for the public and for public history into the writing and the type of publication that she does now. She has always been interested in public history, both pedagogically with K through 12, but she's done public history online. She created a website called We're History. And then she went from there. She's done podcasts, trying to reach a wider audience. She started her Facebook, and a lot of us were reading her in the Facebook days. And then, of course, in 2019, Heather started her newsletter. And it has been a really important touchstone for all of us. So I know you want to hear her. I'm really eager to hear the conversation between the two of them. So without any further delay, please join me in welcoming Keith Mestrich and Heather Cox Richardson.
So before we start, I first of all want to thank everybody who organized this, but I also want to point out that I began writing letters to Nancy as soon as we learned how to write. So the letters from an American are probably her fault. But I also want to thank you all for turning out to support the Meeting House and the Helping Hands, because there is, I think, really no project closer to my heart than this one. My great-great-grandfather built the Meeting House. My parents were married there. They were buried from there. And of course, Buddy and I were married there as well as other family members. So bringing that thing back to life and making it the centerpiece of the community again is enormously important to me. And I love that the community is coming together to do that, because in this moment, what do we need more than community? So take it away, Keith.
Thanks for those opening remarks, Heather, and congratulations, Nancy, and everybody at Helping Hands for what's clearly a very successful evening and will be transformative.
Well, it hasn't been successful yet.
Fundraising-wise, it's been successful. Maybe it can be a little bit more successful. So Heather and I didn't know each other before tonight, and we were sitting back getting together and talking about what we talk about tonight a little bit. And there is no shortage of subjects that we can talk about during these tumultuous times here this evening. But we thought we'd start off maybe on a little bit lighter note. So why don't you tell us a little bit what a day in the life of Heather Cox Richardson is here in Maine?
Well, I roll out of bed about 11, eat some bonbons, So it's actually an interesting question, because people always ask about what my staff looks like. And I'm like, you're looking at it. I wake up, Buddy goes out to hall, gets up about 3:30, and I always try and get in bed before he gets up, because there's nothing worse than crossing that way. It doesn't always happen. This week, there was one time when I was not in bed by the time he got up and went to work. But when I wake up, probably 7:30 or so, I read social media for probably an hour to an hour and 15 minutes to see what the stories are, what people are saying. And then once I know what's there, then I get up, grab a cup of coffee, and read major newspapers from across the country to see what the stories are. And you'd be shocked to know, or maybe not, that they're very similar. It's rare that you get somebody saying something shocking, and when they do, that really jumps out. So yesterday, for example, I wrote about Jim Tankersley's piece in the New York Times about the fact that those 1,000 left behind counties have grown at 5 times the rate under the Biden administration than they did under the Trump administration. And that was of real interest, because I'm always interested in things that are going to change the story. I'm a historian, I'm not a journalist, so I'm looking not for the breaking news, I'm looking for the pieces of our experience that are going to change the way history unfolds. So I look for those, and then usually by about 2 o'clock, and I've got other stuff to do as well, usually by about 2 o'clock, the stories are clear. And if under the Trump administration, I was in terrible trouble because they wouldn't drop stories until after Hannity went off the air. Dead serious. That's why I used to write so late, is because the big news always broke late. If you remember when Trump came down with COVID, that story dropped at midnight. And I was like, really? Like, I just wrote for all these hours, and now you're going to drop that? And I didn't go to bed that night at all, I don't think. But so then, once I know what the stories are, then I try to get repetitive exercise, because that helps me to put them to figure out how to write it. Come home, usually with luck by then, Buddy and I can have supper, and then I start to write. And it takes, if I really know what I'm doing and I'm really in good shape, and a lot of it's history, I can do it in 4 hours. But otherwise, it takes 7 to 9 hours on average. And then I fall into bed, and then I wake up the next morning and do it again.
And we all wake up and read your column in the morning. And then it's
well, but that's part of it. That's part of it, is it's not me. I mean, I didn't set out to do this at all. I mean, I was painting my house because Buddy and I were moving in together, and I had to get rid of my house. And I got stung by a yellow jacket, and I'm allergic, and I didn't have my EpiPen. I actually think my brother-in-law is here tonight. Would that be right, Chris?
Yes.
And Chris was with me, and it's sort of a miracle both of us are still here, because I got stung by a yellow jacket, and as I say, I'm allergic, and he goes, "Oh my God, I'll get your EpiPen." And I said, "Oh, Chris, you're not going to want to hear this." And he goes, "It's at the other house, I'll go get it." And I was like, "Oh, Chris, you're really not going to want to hear this." And he goes, I can still see him, he turns around, he looks at me, his eyes narrow, and he said, "You don't have your EpiPen, do you? And I was like, I was busy this year. And he's like, if you live, I will kill you. So I went home and I was trying to see how bad the reaction was going to be. And I just started to write what things looked like to me. That was September 15th. And thousands of people started to write and ask questions. And I thought, well, I'm not going to flood the zone and write 2 nights in a row. So I wrote again on September 17th, and I've written every night since.
Well,
Yeah, there's a lot of writing.
so now I got a real question to ask you. I'm also extremely allergic to yellow jackets, and I didn't find out until I was in my 50s that was going to happen. And I found it out when I ended up at the emergency room one night doing that. Do you have your EpiPen?
So I now carry an EpiPen, and I was bitten right on this finger, and I have a scar from that, which I sort of feel is the universe laughing at me.
Yeah.
Of course, now my wedding ring covers it, so.
Yeah. Nancy in her introduction talked about a board that I'm really lucky to be the chair of. It's the Francis Perkins Center. Who's Francis Perkins, one of these august citizens of this local community, who is, I think, sometimes the most least known famous Americans that we have. She did tremendous things. Tell us a little bit about her and why I suspect she's an inspiration to somebody like you. She is to me, and what she did in a tumultuous time.
So that's a more complicated question than I suspect that you wanted. Frances Perkins of course, spent her time with her grandparents, her grandmother especially, in Newcastle. Her house is still standing. It's a foundation, and there may be somebody here from it if you want to shout or put in a plug. She was the person who ended up in FDR's cabinet, the first female Secretary of Labor. My mother used to say that FDR was the meanest man in the world because he kept Frances Perkins in labor for 7 years or whatever.
I'm going to use that line, by the way, now.
I'm dead serious. Mother used to say that. But so she is the person who conceived of and put into place the Social Security Act under the FDR administration. And the way she got there was really interesting because she had been a social worker as a young woman in the early aughts of the 20th century, and she had begun to work with Al Smith, the governor, who became the governor, wasn't at the time the governor of New York, in order to try and push back against the lack of regulations and the lack of help for workers in New York City. And one of the ways that she had gotten so enthusiastic about that was she had actually witnessed the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. And she had been, a friend of mine took us on a tour of that area this spring. And what was then Washington Square was a very highfalutin area, and Triangle Shirtwaist was very close to it. And the people who worked at Triangle Shirtwaist lived at the end of the Brooklyn Bridge, what is now the Brooklyn Bridge. So, it was then too, actually. But so they would commute into the Triangle Shirtwaist, which was in this fairly Tony neighborhood, or close to this Tony neighborhood. And one day they were having tea and they started to hear the sirens and the noise, and they ran out to see it, and they saw the factory, which I have to say, if you have an opportunity, go see it, because in the fire, the facade was not damaged. So the inside is totally different, but you are literally standing there looking at the Triangle Shirtwaist Company, the building in which it was housed, which is higher up. And many of you may know that the owners of the company had locked the doors because they were afraid, it was right before Easter weekend, they were afraid both that the girls might take some of the shirtwaists, which were essentially blouses, or might sneak out on the fire escape, so they locked the doors. And the problem with cotton is that cotton fibers are extraordinarily flammable, so that if there's any kind of a spark, it just goes, because essentially the air is almost flammable because of the fibers in the air. So this happened. Weirdly, the elevators kept working, but nobody thought they would work, so they didn't use them, and they ended up at the bottom, and people jumped down the shafts. People jumped out of the windows. So what happened is you had, more than 100 people jumping out of the windows and hitting the sidewalks. And she said and there's wonderful stuff by her online, she said until she died, she could never forget that sound. And she took the lessons that she had learned here in Newcastle with her grandmother and said, we must bring the sense of community to cities, to the country at large. And she began to think about how one could do that, and Al Smith cheered her on and said, I'm going to put together a committee about fires in these buildings, but you know, if you want to look at hours and wages and children working, and I'm not going to say no. So she had been part of that, and when Al Smith, who was connected to the Democratic machine, of course was well connected to FDR, who was part of the New York Democratic machine, when he went into office and they were trying to bring women along into being behind that administration, they urged him to put Frances Perkins in his cabinet, and he called her in and she said, I won't come unless you promise to put all your weight behind Social Security insurance and disability insurance. And he said, do you think we can do that? And she said, I think we're going to try. And that's how we got Social Security, which is the linchpin of the modern American government. Frances Perkins, Newcastle.
So I'll do the plug. so her homestead is open to the public. It's right on River Road. It was bought by the Frances Perkins Center, which used to have their office right next door to the Lincoln Theater here until it was moved back over there on the other side of the river. So you can go over there any day and actually walk the lands and see where she had an interpretation of her life. And it's quite extraordinary that somebody with such a profound impact grew up right here. It's amazing.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah. I want to read to you something that you wrote in November of 2022. You in your Letters from an American, you wrote, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. By understanding the patterns of the past, we can better navigate the present and shape the future." When you think about the events that you use to illustrate things that are happening in America, how do you choose which ones are the most important and which ones are impactful for the events of the day?
Oh, what a wonderful question. So what historians do is not the same thing as journalists do. Journalists look for the breaking story, like I said. They're trying to get people to say stuff. They're trying to get clicks. They're trying to get attention. What historians do is we study how and why societies change. And we look for the things that move pieces. So for example, you will see that I did not cover the Republican presidential primary debates because I couldn't see them making a difference. Donald Trump was so far out in advance, it just didn't seem to me to be more interesting to watch them than it was to do the dishes, honestly. But while they were on, I did write one night about a 30-second clip that Sean Fain of the UAW cut with President Joe Biden saying that he was going to that they were both praising each other. But what that said to me is that the labor movement was getting behind a Democratic president after the Democrats really lost the labor movement in 1980. That to me was worth reporting. The debates, nobody will remember. There is never going to be a book written about the Republican presidential primary debates. So what I look for is, but there will be about Sean Fain. What I look for is the stories that echo that the past is echoing forward. So I'm looking for times when I see something and it simply jumps out to me that we're actually looking at something that we have seen before. And that happened a few days ago, and it was really miserable. I'd worked all day on the afterword for another edition of Democracy Awakening, and so it was literally 1:30 in the morning. And I looked at the news, and it was about, what was it about? I mean, it was so obvious what to write, and I ended up saying this is just like the Civil War. It's exactly like what happened in the Civil War. I'm afraid I don't remember what that was. It was 3 days ago. Does anybody remember? It was about, does anyone remember? It was interesting. Anyway, I wrote about whatever it was, which now is really going to bother me, and then it's it's obvious that this is the next thing that happened. And it's really kind of funny how that stuff jumps out, because you're like, oh, this is, or the other way, you see something big happening there's an anniversary, and you say, well, we have to understand this because that's the only way we can understand this. And I don't know, it just, somebody once said to me, I'm really good at the 19th century because I never left it. And in a way that's really true, because so much of that is just very real to me. Growing up around here, you all remember, those of you who grew up around here, the people that I actually was in a playpen with are in here tonight. And, we used to go get water for Mike Nybo's parents from a well, in a very, they were plastic containers we put it in, but I know what it's like to go to the well to get water, which is probably unusual in 2024.
Let's talk about Shawn Fain for a minute. I didn't think we'd talk about Shawn Fain, but I think he's a potentially transformative figure
I agree.
in the American labor movement right now. The auto industry and the auto workers have always had an outsized influence on what has happened in the power struggle between labor and capital here in this country, probably more so than any other industry that we look at. And that was a union that just declined.
Even the Teamsters?
I think even the Teamsters have these little corruption problems and stuff for a really long time that I think led to some problems. But the auto industry really sort of led the charge of industrial unionism, led the charge of blacks being able to actually be in unions. Lots of really transformative things. Always had a gigantic social conscience and what they could do, and that died. And as we watched the American auto industry decline with the rise of the foreign impacts, but Fain has wanted to sort of take it on, and he's doing it not in this bureaucratic way, not in this I'm going to try and influence public policy. It's this raw challenge to income inequality and other things. I'd love your thoughts just on what's happening there, and is it potentially something bigger?
So Shawn Fain is the president of the United Auto Workers, and last year, I believe it was last year, I lose track of years, ironically, he led the charge to get new contracts out of the big three automakers and went on strike in a very strategic way and ended up getting those contracts, very good contracts, and also after that, other companies that didn't want to unionize gave their workers the same deal. And one of the things that they managed to do was to bring on board the electric vehicle companies and the battery companies. It was a really big deal. And this was, if you remember when Biden went on the picket line, this is what he was doing then, which was also earth-shattering. A president had never gone on a picket line before, although they had expressed enthusiasm for labor, people like FDR had. They'd never actually been on a picket line. So Shawn Fain, I think you're right, challenged the old leaders of the UAW and took that on. But you know what interests me about him is that if you listen to the way he talks, he is not making a case only for income inequality. He is doing it from a position of Christianity, which is really interesting because, of course, Christianity has been co-opted to so much of a degree by the radical right, the extremists, that people forget there are a lot of Christians, and he, I believe, thinks of himself as an evangelical Christian who actually still believe in the social gospel and believe in the idea of treating people well and doing to others and all that. And so a lot of his calls for his people were coming from a base of Christianity and saying we should have fairer wages, we should make sure kids have educations, we should have all that based in Christian values. And that really interested me because you can see a split in the Christian the white evangelical Christian base right now. People like Shawn Fain, but also James Tallarico out of Texas. I don't know if anybody's watching him. He is an outspoken evangelical, I believe minister himself, at least his father was, making the same kind of arguments that the Christian movement has to regain the idea of fairness and taking care of the poor and taking care of the hungry and being welcoming and so on. And Fain then becomes transformative figure not only for the labor movement, but also for the evangelical Christian movement, which got co-opted by the extremists in the 1980s and really kind of went down that road. And I'm watching people like Tallarico and Fain and Tim Alberta, who's written a bunch of books about why he ceased to be an evangelical, and David French from the New York Times, who are saying that's not my Christianity. And that is a really big deal because if you split that evangelical Christian vote, you've split the base of the Republican Party. And I don't know if you saw it today, and you probably not because it happened right before we drove up here. Former Vice President Mike Pence, who is an outspoken evangelical Christian, came out in fury at the Republican national platform that came out yesterday, because he said it was not strong enough on abortion, and that he felt that should have been stronger. And I thought that was really interesting because maybe that's what he's up to, but I wonder, quietly, personally, if that's Pence's way of trying to split that movement himself from the other direction to take votes away from Trump, because we know he doesn't want Trump back in office. This is the kind of stuff I think about all day.
Fascinating and diabolical
Yeah.
little strategy on you and Mike Pence getting together to figure out how to take Trump out.
I think I'm going to leave that up to the fly.
So I'm sure this audience wants to hear your thoughts on a lot of issues of the day. So why don't we turn to some of them? So I had all these fancy questions, your quotes and all things. We're not going to get to any of them because there was these
more fun this way.
two gigantic, tumultuous events that I think happened over the course of the last couple of weeks here. That it's amazing to think about how recent they really are. But maybe the most transformative one was the Supreme Court decision on presidential immunity. And why don't you give us your thoughts just on the devastating nature of that decision?
I'm glad you asked that, because this is really important. What the Supreme Court did on July 1st in Donald J. Trump versus the United States is they tore up the foundational principle of the United States of America. We are based in the idea that we are all equal before the law. No one's below the law, no one's above the law. We've never really lived up to that, but that was a foundational principle. They tore that up, and they said the president, who is the most powerful person in the world, does not have to answer to our legal system. And I expect we're probably also going to talk about things going on the Democratic slate, but this is hair on fire news. This is front page news, above the fold, every day in every newspaper. There is nothing that matters more than that decision. There is nothing in our history. I just said on a national TV show that this is the most important event in American history. And people are like, yeah, what's for dinner? And I cannot tell you how important that is. The ripples that will come from that, but by getting rid of the idea that a president must be bound to the law, so long as the things that the president does come under the duties of that office or are peripheral to the duties of that office, says that a president can, as we have in our past, for example, declare journalists or opponents traitors and have them arrested in whatever else comes from that. Certainly the plans that Stephen Miller has put into Project 2025 to round up 11 million people living in this country and put them in concentration camps, that's okay under this doctrine. I mean, I could go down the list, but whatever you think of when you look at Vladimir Putin or Viktor Orban, that could come here. And in fact, there are people actively trying to make it come here. So there is nothing more important than that. I will also add that people keep saying to me, well, Biden's got it too. It's not actually the way they wrote the decision. The way they wrote the decision is they said that presidents need this or they can't make emergency decisions, which, by the way, all the previous presidents didn't seem to feel they needed. And as recently as 2021, Brett Kavanaugh said a president is bound by the law. Don't start me. But what they said is because this doctrine has never been examined, it's us, the Supreme Court, that will decide whether what the president has done is part of their official duties or not. Which means that if you look at the people who are making those decisions, the majority on the court is the three people that Trump appointed, all Christian nationalists, and Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito, both evangelical Christians themselves, who have both been associated with the attempt to overthrow the government. It's a little hard for me to think they're going to say to Biden, yeah, it's okay to relieve student debt, or it's okay to jail your opponents, or it's okay to do whatever. In fact, they've said no to the first already. I think it's very likely that what they're doing is they're going to turn to Trump and say it's okay, whatever you want to do. And I think John Roberts went along with that in part because he was afraid that Trump was going to do it anyway. And this would at least give him a chance of having some control over him.
Yeah, tell us how different it is from 1973 when Nixon left office and had to be pardoned by Gerald Ford. We don't know what would have happened if he went to trial, but it's really different. I mean, with this decision, it's a completely different game.
Right, 74.
74.
Nixon considers himself bound by the law. You know that he had to step down in August of 74. And what's significant about that, aside from the fact that everybody considered the president bound by the law, was the fact that it was actually Republican senators who went to him and said, dude, it's over. You need to resign. And one of the people who did that was Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater. One of the last people to be willing to have him step down was Gerald Ford, ironically. But Ford then pardoned Nixon, and what's interesting about that is Ford always said that he believed having accepted a pardon was Nixon's way of admitting he had committed the crimes, and that he thought the pardon indicated that Nixon believed he was guilty and that Nixon accepted that he needed a pardon. Nixon never said that publicly. In his memoirs, he said, I didn't do anything wrong. It was the media, the liberal media, who chased me out of office because I could no longer do my job adequately because they kept hounding me. And you know, I've had this fight with people who said it was a good thing what Ford did. Even recently I've had that. And I maintain if Nixon had even had to go to trial, and he would have. I mean, the indictments, I'm sorry, the impeachment articles did not make it out of the House Judiciary Committee, but they had voted on them there, and they were going to go to the House. That's the point at which he resigned. They would have passed the House, and the senators, the Republican senators, told Nixon, dude, it's over. We will find you guilty. What is significant about that, I think, that pardon, is that I maintain if Nixon had had to go to trial, even if he had been found not guilty, that we would not then have had the Iran-Contra affair, we would not have weapons of mass destruction, and we certainly would never have had Donald Trump, who had many legal issues already, running for president. And that's why the rule of law matters.
Extraordinary to think about what happened to Nixon and what may or may not happen to Trump in a new. But let's talk about the court difference between those two times too. In the Nixon era, we were at the tail end of the Warren Court here. Tremendously different than where we are now with the Roberts Court and everything that's happened in between. Thoughts?
Yeah, what do you want to talk about with the court?
So let's talk about this.
You like their little black robes?
So, oh boy, we could talk about so many things, but here's something, and you wrote about this a little bit this morning, right? Which is, there was this giant Trump decision that was right at the end, and there were all the social issues that happened in it, but there was a series of business decisions that were made as well. Probably nothing more impactful than the Loper-Bright decision, which overturned the Chevron doctrine. And,
right.
and why don't you tell us what the Chevron doctrine was? And that's one of those decisions that's very regulatory, very bureaucratic in nature, profound impact on the social safety net, potentially profound impact on how we regulate all of commerce that happens. I'd love your perspective on that, because that really got buried in the news cycle that we've been in. But that's a real legacy potentially of the Roberts Court. That kind of attack on the regulatory agencies.
Yes, and I will say that it did in fact get buried because I was holding Loper-Bright for its own entire piece, and I didn't ever have time to write it because everything else kept coming so fast. So let's step back to poor Frances Perkins, who certainly has already just had her time in the barrel, but the whole point of the government that was developed under FDR was to create a government that worked not for the very wealthy and business the way that the Republicans had put in the 1920s. And one of the reasons I love the 1920s is because in that era, ideology was pure, which sounds really weird, but when the Republicans under Coolidge and Harding, and I could tell you stories, but when they put in their policies, they really believed they were going to work. They really believed that the reason the American economy had always had a problem between labor and capital was because they really hadn't been able to put their ideas into practice fully. And in the 1920s, they got to do that. And it looked like a freaking miracle. Like people have nylon stockings, and they have radios, and they have refrigerators, and they have Chris Crafts. Just gotta say, those are my favorite ads. It looks like it works, and then the whole thing comes crashing down. And all the rottenness of that system becomes very clear with the crash of '29. Interestingly enough, we just passed the other day the lowest point of the stock market in 1932. It happened on July, what is today, 10th? It happened on July 8th. And I was going to write about that because it was, we had new records on all the stock market indices in the United States today, exactly opposite that. And then something else happened, so I couldn't do it. But see, there's a great example of, I saw the height, I saw the low, and I thought, well, that'd be a cool story, right? But what FDR did, and what people like Francis Perkins did, is they created a government that was known as a liberal government, although that change had come really under Teddy Roosevelt. And liberal means a focus on the individual, on the freedom of the individual. And traditionally in America and elsewhere, liberal had meant that you wanted a small government to stay out of the way of individuals' ability to live their lives the way they wanted. But Teddy Roosevelt figured out that with the rise of modern corporations that were so giant, you needed to have a big enough government to hold back business so that it did have to pay its workers a fair wage, and it did have to make sure people could have clean food, and it did have to have some guardrails, be an umpire for that system, or else you were going to lose that system altogether. FDR takes that concept and really tries to make it answer the needs of ordinary Americans in the 1930s. So they develop a government that regulates business, including the financial markets, because those had just been completely corrupt, and you couldn't start a business or anything because it was all about who you knew rather than the fair, than things being fair. It provides a basic social safety net, that's Francis Perkins. It invests in infrastructure so that people in Maine get things like broadband, just saying. It wasn't broadband, it was electricity, but we're being recorded, so I won't tell you that story. But if you watch me, you know that I don't have necessarily the most modern ways of communicating with the world. I will tell you, I was talking to a foreign journalist, and I kept saying, I got to go get to a cell phone, I got to do, a cell tower and all that. And he goes, I am so sorry. We thought you lived in America. And I was like, I do. And the other part of that, of course, was protecting civil rights. Now, the Democrats really couldn't protect civil rights very well because they had to bring along their Southern Democratic base, which was very powerful because positions in Congress at the time were held by seniority, and they still are. Positions in Congress were held by seniority, and Southern senators and representatives were basically in office for life in that period, so they held a lot of important committees. What happens after the war is that first Truman, who's a Democrat, but then really Eisenhower was a Republican, starts to throw the government behind civil rights as well. So we get this idea of the liberal consensus, and that's Democrats and Republicans both believe that the government has this role to play. Well, the reason I gave that big lineup or that big background was because there are a number of people, primarily businessmen, but also racists and traditionalist religious people who want to reinstate the sexist and racist traditions of especially the American South, at the same time that the businessmen want to get rid of business regulations. To some degree, taxes, they're much less worried about taxes than they are about regulations in that period. And what happens is, starting in 1937, they come out with the idea that this entire liberal consensus is a perversion of of the Constitution. They literally write what they call a manifesto in 1937, in which they say, it is unlawful for the government to regulate business because businessmen should be able to do whatever they want. That will be much more efficient than if the government gets involved. There is no role for the government in social safety nets because that belongs to religion and the churches. There should be no investment in infrastructure because that's going to cost tax dollars, and private enterprise should do that. And don't even start us on civil rights. We believe in something called home rule, by which they mean states' rights, the idea that the South is not going to have to move away from segregation. And that platform, the idea of getting rid of regulation, getting rid of a basic social safety net, getting rid of infrastructure and getting like healthcare, for example, and getting rid of the protection of civil rights, is exactly what we are seeing playing out today. You knew I wasn't going to leave Loper-Bright behind, because what Loper-Bright does, it gets rid of regulation. Because what it does is it says that after 1984, there was a doctrine before the Supreme Court that said that the Supreme Court decided that when somebody doesn't like a regulation, they would go to a court, and the court would defer to the experts in an agency unless they said something completely bonkers. They would defer and say, well, these are experts, they know what they're doing, we're going to have to agree that we should only have this many parts per million of arsenic in our peanut butter or something. I made that up, but you know what I'm saying. They took that away. And they said, we will no longer defer to experts. The people who should make those decisions are judges. Well, and this has been one of the projects of the American right, is to put their own judges in place. So rather than having experts decide it, you were having people like Matthew Kaczmarek in Texas saying, I don't believe the FDA should have approved mifepristone. I am going to decide that that is no longer to be available in the United States of America. And that's what they did with Loper-Bright. And within hours, there were already decisions coming down that overturned regulations in a very lopsided way that cited Loper-Bright.
So if judges get to decide what's an official act of the president, and judges get to decide what Congress really meant when they passed a law, not the regulatory agencies or the experts who study it, is the separation of powers gone?
Yes. And here's the really interesting thing that has happened. If you look at the Constitution, the first section of the Constitution is very detailed, and it's about Congress, because Congress represents the people. They're supposed to make our laws. And then they get to the executive, and it's a little less detailed. There's plenty in there, but it's a little less detailed. And then I always joke with my students, they got to the judiciary, and they're like, man, we are tired. Let's have a bunch of judges. Let's all go home. And as you look at that third section, it doesn't say much about what the judiciary is supposed to do. It's supposed to balance arguments between the states. It's supposed to represent the United States against other countries. But other than that, everything that the judiciary does is has either been established by the Congress, or they have taken it upon themselves. So they gave themselves the right of judicial review in 1803 with Marbury v. Madison. That's important, because what we have seen since the 1980s, really since 1986, is a recognition on the part of those Republican extremists. And just so you know, these are, I wrote the history of the Republican Party. These are not, I hate to say real Republicans, because of course they have the Republican Party now. This is not what the Republicans ever stood for. This is something new. And I think pernicious. What they realized is that Americans liked that liberal consensus. They disagreed about different pieces of it. How much should we put into education? How much should we put into regulations? Which regulations are dumb? But they agreed that the government should do that. These people disagreed with that. And what they recognized by 1986 is that people were voting to continue that. So in 1986, we see two major things, three really, but I'll only tell you about two of them. One is that the Republican Party starts to cut down on voting. It starts to say we're plagued by voter fraud, and we need to stop that. Voter fraud is vanishingly rare. And don't even start me on that one. So they start to do that, and the other thing they do is they start to pack the courts. And this is really unprecedented. In the past, courts have always, you wanted good jurists, but you did not have a purity test. You weren't allowed to ask a jurist, what is your position on abortion? What is your position on the having a strong president? You weren't allowed to do that. Edwin Meese starts that under Reagan. What happens with that then is that by 2007, as people do things like elect Barack Obama, or look like they're going to elect Barack Obama, Senate Minority Leader, a new Senate Minority Leader, a guy named Mitch McConnell from Kentucky, recognizes that he can stop Congress from legislating if he weaponizes the filibuster, so that everything will need 60 votes to get through the Senate. Brand new. That is brand new. That has never even been thought of before. There's always been a filibuster, which essentially is a rule. There's no rule that makes senators stop talking. That's all the filibuster is. But by 2007, they arrange it so that Republicans can stop anything from happening just by saying they're going to filibuster. So all of a sudden, Congress really can't do anything. which is also how we get these giant omnibus bills at the end of the session, which I hate. I don't think that's a very good way to go. Your mileage may vary. But at the same time, how then do you get law? You pack the courts with extremists, and then you get cases that will go before certain people, and the judges themselves will hand down the law until we get to the point we're at now, where the Supreme Court is literally saying to plaintiffs, I can't give you that now, but this is what I would want to see if you come back. So what we have now is a very strong judiciary that is handing down its ideas and completely overriding the Congress, which is one of the reasons we are so desperate to get a Democratic Congress back in session so they can change some of those rules.
So there's a legislative branch, executive, judiciary, then there's a fourth estate. What's happening? Why isn't our media, our journalists, not you,
I'm not a journalist.
but others,
Go ahead, bash the journalists. More, give me more.
Why can't they figure out how to dig in deep and explain these technical issues that are so profound on us in a way? What's keeping that from happening?
Well, first of all, there are some very good journalists out there, and you don't have to agree with them literally about anything to recognize that they're really doing phenomenal work. And so that's the first thing. I think probably what you're referring to is the larger organizations of certain media, especially certain legacy media organizations that are not necessarily present. How am I doing over here?
Doing great.
Not necessarily presenting things in a
you redefined
careful...
Republicans in name only a little while ago, so now
that's right.
Media, yeah.
Well, journalism's hard. We need our fourth estate, and journalism's hard, and I want very much not to bash journalists. But we are seeing, I think, a problem, as we know in journalism, because of the entertainmentification of journalism and the desperate need of capital-heavy media outlets to get eyeballs as fast as they can with stories that will attract people. And just so you know, everybody except the independent journalists are hemorrhaging subscribers. People who are considered on the left are hemorrhaging subscribers. People on the right are falling apart. They are falling apart on the right. So I believe it was Gateway Pundit has lost, I think it's 85% of its followers in the last couple of years. That's a lot. Everybody's got this problem. But what that has meant is that people are looking for clicks, they're looking for eyeballs, they're looking for the breaking story, and that means they're not really doing their homework. And they're throwing stuff up that is not true. So polls, for example, I know probably a lot of you are losing sleep over polls. Polls are meaningless now because so many people are salting the polls with things to make their particular position look good. And the only polls you can trust are the ones that are internal to campaigns, and we don't have access to those. So who knows what they're saying. So don't believe anything you read about polls. There are some people I follow because they dissect the polls. Tom Bonnier is a fabulous read because he does that. But so we have this problem of the fact they need a story. And if there isn't a story, they start to create a story and become the story. And the problem with that, of course, is that's not a real reflection of what's happening in the United States right now. So if you read other countries' news, you will see their perspective on the United States is very different than what you're getting here. It's very concerning.
So the other big thing that happened, obviously, was the alarming, debate performance of our president the other night. I just love your reflections on the last 2 weeks and what we've watched happen and where we are and your concerns and maybe even where you think this might go.
Okay, so I'm a prophet of the past and not of the future. And people get very angry with me for not not saying what I think a president should do, or certainly over some international affairs for not trying to put my weight on the scale. I am not in the business of advising political campaigns, although everybody seems to think I am. I'm in the business of saying what happened and how that might affect change. So that being said, I was appalled by the media surrounding the event on CNN, which was not a debate. And I was Well, let me start first by saying it is perfectly legitimate to criticize a president. And you know, many people are saying Biden was badly prepared for that debate. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. I don't care. He was the guy on stage. It was up to him to do it right, because that's the responsibility when you take when you go on stage or when you become the president of the United States. So don't give him a pass for that. But what horrified me was that, first of all, I saw something very different than other people did. But what horrified me was that when the debate went off, every pundit I saw was all over Biden for that debate and didn't say a thing about the fact Trump didn't answer a question. He lied the whole way through. He was a bully. He didn't understand what was being asked of him. He couldn't finish his sentence. And I was gobsmacked that the story has become Biden didn't perform very well that night, and he didn't. Instead of, this guy's a madman. And then within how many days, the Supreme Court said, and he's not bound by the laws. And then people are finally paying attention to 2025, the Project 2025, which calls for rounding up into concentration camps 11 million people living in this country. And yet again today, we saw reports of what Senator Blumenthal and former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said to attack Biden, and both of them came out with the full quotes and said, that is literally not what I said. You are just searching for clicks. And I will actually say a couple of things about the future.
But on that 8 hours after Nancy Pelosi said that, the headline in the New York Times had not changed.
Right. Well, and the whole thing with him having Parkinson's, which was, there was just no sourcing at all on that at all. I mean, it was just, and they've done it with other things as well. There are other occasions lately where the New York Times has just jumped off the deep end, which, you know, why are they doing it? I think it's for clicks. Some people say it's because their CEOs are all Trump donors. I don't know. I would like to know more about the practices in the newsroom. But how that's going to play out is interesting, because you have to remember that the base of the Democratic Party are women, significantly higher, more women vote for the Democrats than men do, and Black Americans, and other minority groups as well, but that's the base. And if you look at the people who are insisting that Biden needs to drop out, it's not those two groups. And so how this is going to play out on that front, I don't know the answer to. I do know that one of the things that frustrates me about the discussions people have about him dropping out is they have this fantasy candidate. Like, there's a reason that it's Biden and Harris at the top of that ticket. There were 20 people running for that office in 2020, and they're the two who came to the top because they could nail that coalition together. And I do not see somebody else who can do that. We could game that out, as my friends and I do. But the other piece about that fantasy candidate that really bothers me is they seem to think that there's going to be no Republican pushback on whoever they choose. And if I'm a Republican operative, I'm like, oh, please, 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 give me anybody else, because Biden doesn't have any dirt. You know, the whole reason they're going after him for being old is because he didn't take money from China. He didn't run off with Epstein. He didn't do all that stuff. So give me anybody that I can flood the zone with made up stuff, with true stuff, I don't care. And the idea that somehow we're going to have this magical person who's going to energize us all when the two of the base communities for the Democrats don't seem unenergized at all right now worries me a lot. Now, one of the things, well, Kamala Harris is, first of all, brilliant. And second of all, has a really good record, and third is phenomenal on foreign affairs, which none of the rest of the bench does have right now. But the coalition, as it's nailed together, is Biden gets the older white vote, Kamala Harris gets people of color and young people. And you split them apart, I don't see it. I mean, like I say, I don't predict the future. You asked me what I'm thinking about here. Kamala Harris is also in a pretty good position should something happen going forward. I'd like to point that out. People all seem to think that it's going to be, she's not going to ever show up. The other piece is that I'm not sure people have looked at closely enough is a lot of people are really angry at the media right now. And what I am observing is how many people who might not really have cared because they thought that the Democratic Party might have gotten their act together because they were working in lockstep for so long, are picking up the ball and running with it. And I don't know if you know who K-Hive is. They're a big conglomerate, not conglomerate, that's the wrong word, a big group of people who are behind Kamala Harris. They have said, take your hands off Joe Biden. A lot of organizations have said that and are really starting to step up to the plate, and that might be a deciding factor. Lots of stuff in play.
Do you look at our current situation politically, and draw a parallel to any other time in American history?
No, and I was going to, the other piece of this is, I'm not sure if she's here tonight, but I met someone the other day who said, listen, I don't care. I'd vote for a fork as long as it was against Donald Trump. And
a fork.
And that's what I'm talking about here. No, there is no parallel. I would have said before the Supreme Court's immunity decision, which honest to God surprised me, because I thought what they were going to do is going to say, of course a president doesn't have immunity, but they were going to delay it long enough that he couldn't go to trial before the election. When they came out and said a president has immunity from committing crimes, I just got nothing. I couldn't, this is the most important event since the founding of this country. To say that the president cannot be prosecuted for committing crimes while in office, just think about what that means to anybody. I don't want anyone to have that power. That's exactly what we rebelled about. In fact, George III had more guardrails around him than Donald Trump has now, and literally. And so when you look at the things that looked parallel in the past, it's the only time we have ever had a major political party in the United States of America that has called for installing a dictator. And so one of the things I say, I'm actually here tonight for the Helping Hands. But what I say when I'm talking about politics to people is, this is our moment to defend American democracy. And that doesn't mean that we're going to agree about immigration, or that we're going to agree about finances, or we're going to agree about education, or we're going to agree about all the many things we disagree about. It's important that we disagree, because that's how you come to good solutions, and that's how you listen to each other, and that's how you I call it crowdsourcing. You want to have someone say, Richardson, that's the dumbest damn thing I've ever heard, because here's what's really happening, and you want to have me say, oh, I never thought about that, right? That's how democracy works. But in this moment, those divisions don't matter. They really don't matter. What matters is we don't let a dictator take over the United States of America, because it's not just us. If Donald Trump becomes president, or a Trump-like figure, by the way, I got a box of donuts riding on the fact he's not going to get the nomination. Because that's actually somewhat problematic for him, and we didn't talk about that. That's actually quite interesting. But Trump, or a Trump-like figure, gets into power, we will no longer defend NATO. NATO has kept the world from a full-blown world war for 75 years. We're celebrating it right now. I just did an interview with Antony Blinken, by the way, which we're about to put up on the internet. He's really smart. Mm-hmm. And I looked a bit like a weenie. We're going to cut those parts. That's real power. And we are going to ally with Vladimir Putin and Viktor Orban and Benjamin Netanyahu, and those people who believe that some people are better than others and have the right to rule. And when you put the power of the American government behind dictators around the world, Putin's already said he's going to invade the countries around him, and they are already preparing for war. And if those things go, other countries will go. And we're looking at a world conflagration over the issue of human self-determination. And we, in the United States of America, have the potential in this election to stop that and to reclaim the noble ideals that our forefathers and mothers have had when they fought World War II, for example, which was a hell of a mess, and when they stood up for civil rights throughout our history, or when Teddy Roosevelt took on industrialists, or when the labor movement decided that workers should have an equal say, or when people like Abraham Lincoln and the fledgling Republicans said, no, we're not going to turn this country over to an elite group of slave owners to destroy democracy. This is our moment to protect that for the world. And by God, we better do it, because we are very close to losing it. So this is new and important.
So thank you for reminding us about the American greatness and some of the things that we've been able to do despite all our flaws. And last question, and as we bring the conversation home tonight, we've talked about a lot of pretty dark things. What gives you hope?
Yeah, how y'all doing out there?
What gives you hope?
So what gives me hope is this, and I mean, obviously you're here for the helping hands. But I've been traveling this country now for 6 months. And by the way, I never wanted to write the letters. They were not my project. You know, my project was painting the windowsills, you know? People care. They care a lot. And, you know, people always ask me what gives you hope. And I always say you. You know, you would have turned out for the helping hands 10 years ago, but the people I usually talk to, I say, would you have turned out 10 years ago to listen to a college professor talking about democracy? And they all laugh, because the answer is pretty clearly no, right? People around this country are waking up to the fact that we could lose everything we have. And by God, they are turning out. And they are turning out to protect democracy, but they are also turning out to remind us of what community means and what our country can be at its best. And one of the things about an era like this, when all the cards go up in the air and we get to grab them and put them back into some kind of order, is that those are also extraordinarily creative times. We have new music, we have new literature, we have new voices, we have new languages, we have new people, we have new connections to other people around the world. In these times, we see this outpouring of all that humanity can be, but certainly that all Americans can be. And when I write those letters every freaking night, right, and my warm bed is just over there, I'm not doing it because it's my hobby, right? I'm doing it because there is this movement around this country, and perhaps having looked at what just happened in Poland and England and France, around the world, a recognition that we can come together as a community, not only to protect democracy, but also to make this world so much better than it has been, and to take on climate change, and to take on pandemics, and to take on food crises, and to take on wars, and to try and create the world that we dreamed of. And when I think about that, you know, it's worth staying up.
So I'm sure I speak for every one of us in this theater. Thank you, Heather, for tonight. And thank you for what you do. And although it's sometimes probably a slog to stay up late at night, keep doing it because it matters. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming.